For thousands of years, one body of water has been called the place where nothing lives and nothing escapes. The Dead Sea. No fish, no plants, no future. But something changed in 2026. The water is moving, and the direction it is moving matches a warning written 2,500 years ago, word for word, detail for detail. Ezekiel saw this. He wrote it down, and most people dismissed it as poetry. They are not dismissing it anymore. There is a place on this earth that sits so far below sea level that the air above it feels different. The Dead Sea. It rests at the lowest point on the surface of the planet, nearly 1,400 feet below the ocean, surrounded by desert, bordered by cracked salt flats that stretch in every direction like the surface of another world. For centuries, travelers who reached its shore described the same thing: silence, stillness, a body of water so dense with salt that nothing sinks, nothing swims, and nothing grows. The ancient Romans called it lacus asphaltites, the lake of asphalt. Even they understood that this was not a place built for life. And for decades, modern science agreed. Starting in the mid-20th century, researchers began tracking the Dead Sea with precision instruments, satellites, and hydrological models. What they found was consistent and predictable. The sea was shrinking. Every single year, the water level dropped by roughly 1 meter. The Jordan River, which once fed it generously from the north, had been heavily diverted for agriculture and municipal use. Less water coming in, more evaporating out. The math was simple. By the early 2000s, scientists were projecting a slow, steady decline. The southern basin had already been partially converted into industrial evaporation ponds for mineral extraction. Maps were being redrawn. Shorelines that appeared in photographs from the 1960s were now dry land. The Dead Sea was retreating, and the models said it would continue retreating for generations. That was the consensus. Then the readings from the northern basin started coming in differently. Monitoring stations along the northern shoreline began registering unusual subsurface activity. Underwater springs, long dormant or undetected, were pushing fresher water up through the lakebed. The salinity levels in specific zones began to shift. Satellite imagery showed surface changes that did not align with the evaporation models scientists had relied on for 50 years. This was not supposed to happen. The Dead Sea does not behave this way. It does not recover. It does not push back. Everything about its geography, its hydrology, its regional water supply, points toward continued decline. But the data said something different. And when geologists began mapping the direction of the subsurface water movement, they found something that stopped the analysis cold. The water was not moving randomly. It was not dispersing outward in every direction the way a typical spring system would behave. The movement had a direction, a specific, traceable, unmistakable direction. North, toward the Jordan River, toward the same path that an ancient prophet described in precise detail, 2,500 years before a single satellite was ever launched. Nobody was ready for what that comparison revealed. What Ezekiel wrote was not vague. It was not symbolic language open to interpretation. It was specific. And that specificity is exactly what makes the next part of this story so difficult to dismiss. Ezekiel was not a poet writing metaphors by a fire. He was a priest, a trained, disciplined observer of detail. When he recorded his visions, he recorded them the way an engineer records measurements, directions, distances, depths, specific outcomes tied to specific conditions. And in chapter 47 of his writings, he described something that would have sounded completely impossible to anyone who heard it. Water flowing out from beneath a temple in Jerusalem, moving eastward, gaining volume as it traveled, reaching the Dead Sea, which he called the Eastern Sea, and transforming it. The salt water turning fresh, fish appearing in massive numbers, fishermen lining the shores, trees growing on both banks, fruit every month, leaves that heal, a Dead Sea becoming alive. He did not say this might happen. He did not frame it as a possibility. He recorded it as a vision of what would come. And for 2,500 years, readers looked at the Dead Sea, saw its salt, its silence, its absolute hostility to life, and filed Ezekiel's words under the category of distant future, something for another generation to worry about. But here is what most people never focused on. Ezekiel described the water moving in a specific direction before it ever reached the sea. He described it flowing east from Jerusalem, down through the desert terrain, following the natural gradient of the land toward the Jordan Rift Valley. That path, that exact geographical corridor, is the same corridor where subsurface water movement is now being detected, pushing northward from the Dead Sea toward the Jordan. Two directions meeting in the middle. And that is not the detail that stops researchers cold. This is. Ezekiel described the transformation happening in stages. First, the water moves. Then the shoreline changes. Then life appears. Not all at once. In sequence. Like a process unfolding step by step. Look at what is happening now in that same sequence. The subsurface water movement came first. Then the salinity shifts along the northern shoreline. Then something that even secular environmental researchers have begun documenting with growing confusion. Sinkholes. The Dead Sea region has been plagued by sinkholes for decades. As the water retreats and underground salt layers dissolve, the ground collapses without warning. Thousands of them have opened across the shoreline. Roads swallowed. Infrastructure destroyed. Fields turned into cratered moonscapes overnight. But some of those sinkholes are now filling with water. Not salt water, fresh water, pushing up from below. And in several documented cases along the northern basin, that fresh water is clear enough to support aquatic life. Researchers have found small fish in sinkholes that were dry desert craters just years before. Ezekiel said the waters would swarm with living creatures wherever the river flows. He wrote that in 593 BC. And right now, fish are appearing in places that have never supported life in recorded history. That is either the most remarkable coincidence in the history of natural science, or it is something else entirely. But the water and the fish are only two pieces of what Ezekiel described, because the third element of his vision is now visible from space. Satellites do not have opinions. They do not interpret. They do not speculate. They measure. They record. They produce images based entirely on what is physically present on the ground beneath them. And what they have been recording around the Dead Sea in recent years does not match what should be there. Green. Not the faint, scattered green of an isolated desert plant clinging to a crack in dry rock. Concentrated growth. Expanding patches of vegetation appearing in areas that satellite records show as barren salt flat for as far back as the imaging archive goes. The lowest point on Earth is growing things. Environmental researchers have been tracking this carefully. The explanation most commonly offered involves the freshwater springs pushing up through the sinkhole fields. Where fresh water surfaces, the salt concentration in the surrounding soil drops. Where the salt drops, seeds that have waited dormant in the ground for years, sometimes decades, finally have a chance. And they are taking it. This is not a gradual process happening over centuries. The rate of vegetation expansion in certain zones along the northern and western shoreline has been described by observers as faster than expected, fast enough to be visible in time-lapse satellite comparisons spanning just a few years. Now here is where the biblical text becomes uncomfortably specific again. Ezekiel 47 verse 12 describes trees growing on both banks of the water that flows from the temple toward the Dead Sea. He says the trees will bear fruit every month, and their leaves will not wither. He connects the appearance of this vegetation directly to the movement of the water. Water moves first, then vegetation follows. That is exactly the sequence being observed. But there is an older text that frames this even more precisely. Isaiah 35 describes the desert and the dry land becoming glad, the wilderness rejoicing and blooming like a crocus, waters breaking forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. the burning sand becoming a pool. Isaiah wrote those words roughly 2,700 years ago. And right now, burning sand is becoming pools. Documented, photographed, measured by instruments that have no interest in theology. Here is what makes this more than a nature story. The Dead Sea sits at the center of one of the most geopolitically contested regions on the planet. Any significant environmental change in that corridor does not happen in isolation. It draws attention. It draws resources. It draws power. And in 2025 and 2026, that attention has arrived in a way that geopolitical analysts are struggling to fully explain. When land changes, power follows. That is not a spiritual statement. That is history. Every significant geographical shift in the ancient Near East reshaped who controlled the region, who fought over it, and who claimed divine authority over its future. The Dead Sea region is no different. For most of the 20th century, the Dead Sea was treated primarily as an industrial resource. Potash, magnesium, bromine. The minerals extracted from its waters are used in fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and chemical manufacturing. Companies on both the Israeli and Jordanian sides of the water have operated large-scale extraction facilities for decades. The economic value was geological, not geopolitical. That calculus is shifting. In 2025, a series of diplomatic and economic discussions quietly emerged around the future of the Jordan Rift Valley. The Abraham Accords, signed in 2020, had already begun repositioning the broader Middle East geopolitically. New relationships between Israel and several Arab states created a framework that previous generations would have called unthinkable. But the land itself was creating new conversations. The freshwater discoveries along the Dead Sea Basin have significant implications for a region that has struggled with water scarcity for decades. Jordan faces some of the most severe water shortages on the planet. Israel has invested heavily in desalination. The Palestinian territories have faced chronic water access issues for years. Freshwater emerging in the Dead Sea Basin is not just an environmental curiosity. It is a strategic resource. And strategic resources in this region have always attracted global attention. Biblical scholars who track geopolitical developments against prophetic timelines have noted something consistent across multiple ancient texts. The restoration of the land of Israel, specifically the transformation of its barren places, is described as occurring in proximity to a gathering of nations. A convergence of global interest in the region that precedes what the texts describe as a final realignment of world power. Ezekiel himself wrote extensively about this convergence. His later chapters describe nations turning their attention toward Israel in the end of days. He names specific directions from which pressure will come. He describes the land being described as a target of desire by outside powers. Look at the current geopolitical map. Russia's positioning in Syria places a major military power directly north of Israel. Iran's continued proxy network through Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza creates sustained pressure on Israel's borders. China's expanding economic relationships across the Middle East represent a form of strategic encirclement that analysts are actively debating. And the United States continues to recalibrate its Middle East posture in ways that no administration has fully resolved. Every direction Ezekiel pointed to has a major power standing in it right now. And at the center of all of it, the land is changing. The water is moving. The desert is greening. The sinkholes are filling with life. And nations that have not focused on this specific corridor in decades are suddenly paying attention. That convergence is not random, and it is accelerating. But what accelerates alongside it is something that the texts describe with a clarity that is increasingly difficult to read as purely symbolic. A countdown, not a vague spiritual metaphor. A specific warning tied to observable physical conditions. Conditions that were supposed to be impossible. Conditions that are now being measured, photographed, and documented by researchers who have no theological agenda whatsoever. The ancient scrolls described a window a period when these signs would appear together, not separately, not across centuries, together, simultaneously, in a compressed window of time that would be recognizable to anyone paying attention. That window is open right now, and the question nobody has fully answered yet is how long it stays open. There is a pattern in how ancient warnings work. They do not arrive all at once. They build, layer by layer, sign by sign, each one pointing to the next, each one slightly harder to dismiss than the one before it. And then at some point, the pattern becomes undeniable. The question is always the same. At what point does a person stop calling it coincidence? The Dead Sea shrinking was predicted by science. What was not predicted was the reversal. The freshwater springs were not in any model. The fish appearing in sinkholes were not in any projection. The vegetation expanding across salt flats was not in any environmental forecast. And the geopolitical convergence pressing in from every direction that Ezekiel named was not in any political analyst's 5-year plan. Each of these things, taken alone, has a natural explanation. But together, in sequence, in the specific order the ancient text described, in the specific geography the ancient text named, in the specific time period when every other marker the text identified is also present. That combination does not have a clean scientific explanation, and researchers, both secular and theological, are beginning to say so publicly. Dr. Gerald Fleury, who has written extensively on prophetic geography, has stated that the physical transformation of the Dead Sea region represents one of the most tangible intersections of biblical prophecy and observable reality in modern times. He is not alone in that assessment. Israeli environmental scientists, studying the sinkhole formations, have published papers noting that the freshwater emergence pattern does not conform to standard hydrogeological models for the region. They are not making prophetic claims. They are simply stating that the data does not fit what they expected. When secular science says the data does not fit, and ancient prophecy says this is exactly what would happen, that gap deserves serious attention. But here is what the texts say comes after the signs. Not peace, not a gradual improvement, not a slow transition into a better world. A shaking. Ezekiel uses that word specifically. A great shaking in the land of Israel. The mountains thrown down. The steep places collapsed. Every wall falling to the ground. The language is geological as much as it is spiritual, and it follows directly from the restoration signs. The healing of the waters, the greening of the desert, the gathering of nations. First the signs, then the shaking. And tucked inside that sequence is something that most readers skip past because it sounds too specific to be literal. Ezekiel describes the shaking being felt by all living things. Fish of the sea, birds of the sky, beasts of the field, every creeping thing, every human being on the face of the earth. Not a regional event, not a local conflict. Every human being on the face of the earth. That is either the language of a man describing a vision far beyond his comprehension, or it is a precise description of something coming that no generation before this one has had the technology or the global connectivity to experience simultaneously. Every human being, at the same time, aware of the same event. That was impossible to imagine for most of human history. It is not impossible anymore. And sitting at the center of that vision, at the geographical heart of everything Ezekiel described, is the Dead Sea, the lowest point on earth, the place that was supposed to stay dead forever, the place where the water is now moving north, where fish are appearing in desert craters, where green is spreading across salt flats that have been barren since before recorded history, where nations are turning their attention in exactly the configuration the ancient text said they would. The signs are not coming. They are here. The only remaining question is the one that Ezekiel left deliberately unanswered. Not because he did not know, but because the answer was never meant for the generation that read it first. It was meant for the generation watching it happen. There is one more piece to this. Something found in the region just recently that connects the physical changes in the Dead Sea Basin to a discovery that researchers have not yet fully explained. A find that ties the water, the land, the prophecy, and the geopolitical moment together in a way that nobody anticipated. What was found, where it was found, and what it might mean. That is where this goes next.